Let's take a little bit closely at the contractual regime on this, because I suppose the starting point is to look at what the contract says. What observations do you have around that? Because it appears that what was eventually signed off was not a sort of standard form contract for the industry.
No, the contract was rushed, and as a result, a contract to purchase ships for an amount of money just under 100 million was signed. But within the contract, it would normally have specified what would be done, what every aspect would be in a very, huge document. A lot was lacking, in particular just how it was going to be done and what the nature of it was. And as a consequence, when the construction started with Ferguson Marine, they were finding that things were going to cost more because the whole nature of the ship being procured is the wrong type of ship. They were asking for more money, so the contract just went up and up, but it wasn't specified within the contract. And then the relationship between CMAL, the procurement agency, and Ferguson Marine just disintegrated. We had a Scottish Government independent investigator from a marine expert from the Netherlands come in, who basically said that CMAL were failing to cooperate with the builders. He went to the government about that, but the action of the government was to put the yard into administration. So this was signed off very quickly because the Scottish Government wanted a big announcement, because it was the First Minister's first conference in September 2015 as the First Minister, having taken over from Alex Salmond in the November before. They wanted a big announcement. This was rushed through. CMAL didn't want to give the order to Ferguson's. They were forced by the Scottish Government to give the order to Ferguson's. So the order went in far too quick. The contract was signed, but aspects of the contract that were fundamental, whether for a car or for a ship, weren't decided. And accordingly, when Ferguson started building, they were building something that hadn't been specified, so they asked, understandably, for more money, which is why the Scottish Government gave them more money.
I want to come to the paper trail in a moment, where we can see the decisions that were taken, when they were taken, who took these decisions. But I suppose there's a first question. In your view, was Ferguson's actually capable in a technical sense of delivering these ships? Did they have any culpability for what's going on here?
I've no doubt Ferguson's could have done some things better, but we have to again go to the evidence of Commodore Van Beek, who was the Dutch expert brought in. He made it quite clear that Ferguson's were perfectly capable of doing the job. He thought that the work had done in getting the yard ready by Jim McCall was perfectly adequate. And indeed, it's also got to be remembered that other orders were coming in for Ferguson Marine, both for fishing boats and indeed potentially for hydrogen. So the yard was operating. The yard had a skilled staff. The problem rested with the contract, and the problem rested with the attitude and actions of CMAL.
We'll come to the sort of political pressure that was applied, but what observations would you make in terms of the initial procurement? What, for example, was Mr. Van Beek saying?
Well, Van Beek was brought in later in the day after everything had been done, but Van Beek, as an independent arbiter appointed by the Scottish Government, a Dutch expert with no axe to grind, he was certain that these ships were in fact not the ships that CalMac wanted. I can quote from him when he says, 801 and 802 were not the ships CalMac wanted. And he added, when I met the chief executive of CalMac, I was very surprised to discover that it was not and had not been involved, except in having made some observations right at the beginning of the process when it said that it did not want LNG ships. So one of the major problems is LNG ships were wanted by CMAL. They're not the sort of ships that are built at that size. We don't have the facilities for LNG fuel distribution in Scotland, and still don't. And indeed, it was basically, as with the Scottish Parliament, you were building a prototype ship, and as befell construction of a Parliament, disaster befell construction of 2 ships for communities in Scotland.
To what extent in this calamitous state of affairs which you're describing to me, to what extent is the issue here CMAL, and to what extent was the pressure from ministers, not for economic reasons but for political reasons, how much responsibility do they bear for this?
Well, both have an aspect of responsibility. Fundamentally, it's CMAL who procured the wrong ships and who, as Commander Van Beek said, as well as procuring the wrong ships, basically their attitude towards Ferguson's as they were trying to build it was almost childish, failing to work, cooperate. Van Beek didn't want administration. He suggested to the Scottish Government there should be mediation, but that was rejected by CMAL. So CMAL has to take the responsibility for that. But the Scottish Government has to accept culpability in that it rushed this contract through, which is why we had a lack of specification. And secondly, they failed to draw CMAL to line. At some stage when Van Beek said it should be mediation, not administration, why didn't they take his advice? In fact, if the Scottish Government had dismissed CMAL and if they were to abolish it, I think you would find there'd be many communities, the length and breadth of islands and indeed remote parts of Scotland, would be cheering and clapping.
Before we get to the role of specific ministers, what broader questions because you've put down a lot of parliamentary questions, you've written a lot of letters to this, what are some of the other broader issues which you think need to be addressed?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally in Scotland, why do we have CMAL? What is their point? We have CalMac who run the ferry services. There's arguments that the RMT union make, and I support for a more people's CalMac. Communities should be represented, not just businessmen on the board. But CMAL were brought in when everything was almost to be privatised, where CMAL were going to be a procurement agency, and some orders would go to CalMac, some orders would go to P&O or whoever, and that would then be it. It was almost a Sir Keith Joseph-side replication that government met once a year to decide which private companies were getting public services. So CMAL really doesn't have a role in my view. CMAL should be abolished because CalMac should be capable of deciding what ships they want, i.e. we don't want LNG, and then they should be capable either through Transport Scotland or a Scottish dedicated maritime department of making sure that the correct ships are ordered. I would hope most of them would come from Ferguson's and elsewhere in Scotland, but if some of them can't, then they place the orders. But CMAL, it seems to me, is a job creation scheme for corporate types and is actually failing to deliver for Scottish communities, and fundamentally is also failing to protect Scottish shipbuilding.
Just give me a commentary from your perspective as you understand it about the number of ministers within the Scottish Government who were aware of all the concerns, who helped sign off the contract, and perhaps indicate to me who you think the key minister in all of this is, because in terms of the chain of accountability, this is quite an important point.
No, obviously I wasn't in government at the time. I had left government and indeed would shortly leave Parliament. I mean, the real minister involved was Derek Mackay, but then nothing could be signed off without authority from above. And indeed, it's certainly clear that Derek Mackay was on holiday, so it was signed off by others. But I mean, the nature of the Scottish Government, this had to go to the very top. Given that the push was on for the announcement at the SNP conference in September 2015, it's inconceivable that the First Minister wasn't appraised of what was happening and why it was being done, and indeed that matters were being expedited. So I think this goes to the very top.
In fairness to the First Minister, on several occasions in the chamber, in that Parliament, she has stood up and she has told MSPs everything that happens on the watch of this government, the buck stops with me. But it begs a simple question. If the buck stops with the First Minister and it all happens in her watch, what does the buck stopping with her actually mean in practical terms?
Well, and all this was launched at the SNP conference in a major speech by the First Minister in her first leadership speech in that office that she had aspired to.
But if she is ultimately accountable for the loss of £160 million of public money and counting, what does being accountable for that actually mean in practice?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, my worry is not simply the 160 million. At the end of the day, I fear that these ships are really probably never going to sail. We'd be better just to scrap them, procure the right ships and build them in Ferguson's. But if we got the right ships, we have the right skills in Ferguson's, we're not getting the money back. And we do have to have an inquiry, we have to learn lessons, but the lessons we have to learn is CMAL has to go, you've got to order the right ships. That's got to be discussed by those who operate them, such as CalMac, and by those who require them, such as communities, should have a say. And indeed, we've got to build them in Scottish yards. When we require work, we shouldn't be sending ship orders to Turkey.